The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make an entire operating room go still. For a fraction of a second, even the monitors seemed to hesitate, as if the machines themselves were trying to understand what had just happened. "Stay with me," because the man standing at the center of that silence had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything he owned would begin to unravel in a courtroom he could not control. 6 hours earlier, Olivia Carter Hale had stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in a Manhattan penthouse, one hand resting gently over her 8-month pregnancy, watching the city wake up beneath a gray April sky. The skyline looked sharp, expensive, untouchable, just like the life she had married into. Behind her, Ethan Hale adjusted his cufflinks without looking up, his reflection cold and precise in the glass. He spoke in numbers, in timelines, in deals closing before noon, as if the day ahead was nothing more than another transaction. Olivia listened, but her attention drifted to the quiet rhythm beneath her hand, a steady reminder that not everything in her life could be scheduled or negotiated. "We need to finalize the trust documents today," Ethan said, finally turning toward her, his tone clipped, efficient. "Before anything complicates the situation." Olivia didn't respond right away. She had learned that silence made him uncomfortable, that it forced him to fill the space with more than just control. "This isn't a situation," she said softly. "It's our child." Ethan's expression tightened, not with anger, but with something colder, impatience. "It's both," he replied. "And I'm making sure it doesn't become a liability." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Liability. As if something living, something growing, could be reduced to a line on a balance sheet. Olivia turned back to the window, her reflection faint now against the city. There had been a time when she believed this world was built on strength, on ambition, on people who knew how to win. Now, she was beginning to understand that some empires were built on something far more fragile, control disguised as certainty. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. A message from her doctor. Urgent. She read it once, then again, her fingers tightening slightly around the device. Elevated pressure. Immediate evaluation recommended. She didn't panic. Not outwardly. But something inside her shifted, subtle and sharp, like a crack forming beneath polished glass. "We need to go," she said. Ethan glanced at his watch. "I have a call in 20 minutes. This can't wait." For a moment, he looked like he might argue. Then he exhaled, already reaching for his jacket, already recalculating. "Fine. We'll make it quick." Quick. That was the word he used for everything he didn't want to deal with. As they stepped into the elevator, descending from the quiet luxury of their private floor into the noise of the city, Olivia caught her reflection again in the mirrored walls. Calm. Composed. Almost invisible. Ethan stood beside her, already on his phone, already speaking in the language of markets and margins, as if nothing else in the world demanded his full attention. Neither of them knew that by the end of the day, the sterile lights of an operating room would expose more than just a medical emergency. They would reveal exactly who Ethan Hale was when control slipped for even a second, and more importantly, who Olivia Carter had always been. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and polished steel, the kind of place where everything was supposed to be controlled, measured, predictable, and yet the moment Olivia stepped through the sliding glass doors, something felt off, like the air itself was holding its breath. Nurses moved quickly but quietly, their sneakers whispering across the floor, their voices low and precise, and somewhere in the distance a monitor kept a steady rhythm that echoed faintly through the hallway. Ethan walked half a step ahead, already irritated by the delay, already glancing at his phone as if the world inside that screen mattered more than the one unfolding around him. "Let us keep this efficient," he said without looking back, his voice calm but edged with impatience. Olivia did not answer. She was focused on the pressure building beneath her ribs, a tightening that came and went in waves, subtle but undeniable, like a warning her body was trying to send before something irreversible happened. At the intake desk, a nurse with kind eyes and a clipped New Jersey accent took one look at Olivia's chart and straightened slightly, her tone shifting from routine to urgent in an instant. We are going to get you upstairs right away, okay? She said gently, placing a reassuring hand near Olivia's arm without quite touching her. Olivia nodded, allowing herself to be guided, while Ethan signed forms with quick, sharp strokes, barely reading the lines he was authorizing. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of themselves that looked almost composed from a distance, but up close told a different story. Olivia's breathing had grown more deliberate, her hand steady against her stomach, while Ethan's reflection showed a man calculating timelines, consequences, optics. When the doors opened, the operating floor was quieter, colder, the lighting harsher, designed to eliminate shadows, and with them, uncertainty. A doctor approached, introducing herself as Dr. Hannah Brooks, her voice calm, professional, the kind that made people trust her without question. We are seeing some signs we do not want to ignore, she explained, walking alongside Olivia as they moved toward a prep room. We are going to monitor you closely and run a few immediate tests. Olivia listened, absorbing every word, while Ethan stepped in, his tone cutting through the conversation with practiced authority. How long is this going to take? He asked. Dr. Brooks paused, just briefly, then answered with measured patience. As long as it needs to ensure both patient and baby are stable. That answer did not satisfy him. It was not precise, not quantifiable, not something he could control. Inside the prep area, machines hummed softly, screens flickering with lines and numbers that translated life into data. Olivia was helped onto a bed, sensors placed carefully, the room filling with a quiet urgency that no one named out loud. Ethan remained near the doorway, his presence sharp against the clinical calm, his attention divided between Olivia and the constant stream of messages lighting up his phone. We need to address those documents, he said again, lowering his voice but not softening it. We cannot keep delaying decisions. Olivia turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time since they arrived. There was no anger there, no fear, just a clarity that had not been there before. Not now, she said. 2 words. Simple. Final. For a moment, nothing else moved. Not the machines, not the staff, not even Ethan. And in that stillness, something shifted again, deeper this time, like the moment before a fault line gives way, when everything appears intact, but the break has already begun. The room did not explode into chaos, it tightened, like every person inside instinctively sensed that a line had just been approached, if not crossed, and no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. The machines continued their steady rhythm, the soft beeping almost too calm for the tension building beneath it, while Dr. Hannah Brooks exchanged a brief glance with one of the nurses, a silent communication that something was no longer routine. Ethan took a step forward, his voice lower now but sharper, controlled in the way that suggested he was used to being obeyed. We do not have time for hesitation, he said. This needs to be resolved now. Olivia did not raise her voice. She did not move quickly. She simply turned her head again, her eyes steady, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach as if anchoring herself to something real in a room that suddenly felt unreal. No, she said, and this time the word carried weight, not resistance for the sake of argument, but a boundary that could not be negotiated. That was when the atmosphere shifted completely. A nurse near the monitor paused, her fingers hovering over the controls. Another adjusted her stance slightly, placing herself closer to Olivia without making it obvious. Dr. Brooks stepped forward, positioning herself just enough between them to re-establish the focus of the room. Mr. Hale, she said evenly, our priority is the patient. We need to continue the evaluation without interruption. For a second, Ethan did not respond. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering between Olivia and the staff, calculating, recalibrating, as if trying to decide whether this was still a situation he could steer. Then his phone buzzed again, the sharp vibration cutting through the silence like an unwelcome reminder of a different world pressing in. He glanced at the screen, and whatever he saw there hardened something in his expression. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said, not looking at Olivia anymore, but at the situation as a whole, as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a moment to be understood. Olivia's breathing slowed, deliberate, controlled, each inhale measured, each exhale steady. She was not shrinking back. If anything, she seemed more present than she had been all day, as though the clarity she found in that single word had settled into her completely. "It is already complicated," she replied quietly. "You just did not notice." The words landed differently than anything else she had said, not confrontational, not emotional, just true in a way that did not invite debate. Dr. Brooks nodded slightly to the nurse, who began adjusting the monitor, her movements precise and focused, bringing the room back to its purpose. "We are going to proceed," the doctor said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you would like to stay, you will need to respect that." Ethan exhaled slowly, slipping his phone back into his pocket, the decision not to escalate visible but not generous. He stepped back toward the edge of the room, reclaiming a position where he could observe without being challenged, his posture rigid, his silence louder than his words had been. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible took place. Control shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the balance was no longer where it had been when they walked in. Outside the room, down the quiet hallway, a security camera continued recording, its small red light blinking steadily, capturing everything without judgment, without interruption, storing a version of the truth that no one inside was thinking about yet. And somewhere several floors below, in a private office overlooking the city, a man named William Carter would soon receive a call that would change the direction of this day in ways no one in that operating room could yet see. Several floors below, far removed from the sterile quiet of the operating level, William Carter stood in a glass-walled office overlooking Lower Manhattan, the Hudson River cutting a slow silver line through the city as morning traffic thickened along the avenues. His office was silent except for the faint hum of climate control and the distant echo of helicopters crossing the skyline, a space designed for clarity, for decisions that moved markets and reshaped companies without ever raising a voice. A digital screen stretched across one wall, displaying live financial data in shifting columns of green and red, numbers rising and falling with the restless rhythm of global capital. William did not watch it constantly. He did not need to. People like him did not chase information. It came to them. His phone rested face down on the desk, a deliberate choice, a habit formed over decades of refusing to be interrupted unless something truly mattered. When it vibrated once, sharply, against the polished surface, he did not reach for it immediately. When it vibrated again, longer this time, he turned slowly, his attention narrowing with quiet precision. The name on the screen was not one that appeared often. Rebecca Sloan. He answered without greeting. "Talk to me." On the other end, Rebecca did not waste time with context. Her voice was controlled, but there was an urgency beneath it that did not belong to routine legal updates. "She is at St. Vincent's. 8th month. Complications under observation. And there was an incident." William did not react outwardly. He did not ask what kind of incident. He did not need the word defined for him. Silence stretched for half a second, then another, the kind of silence that carried weight instead of confusion. "Is she stable?" he asked. "For now," Rebecca replied. "But this is not just medical. There are witnesses. There is documentation. And there is a man in that room who still thinks he controls the narrative." William's gaze shifted to the city beyond the glass, but he was no longer seeing buildings or traffic or water. He was assembling pieces, aligning facts, measuring consequences. "Send me everything," he said. "Names. Footage. Access logs. I want a complete record before anyone has time to edit the truth." Rebecca hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then added, "There is more. He pushed for documents this morning. Trust structure tied to the child. Timing is not accidental." That was enough. That was the detail that moved this from concern to calculation. William picked up his phone, already moving toward his desk, already opening a secure line that connected him to people who did not ask questions, only executed instructions. "Lock every external transfer connected to Hale Biotech, he said calmly when the line connected. Flag any attempt to move capital in the next 12 hours. And pull his exposure. All of it. There was no hesitation on the other end. Understood. Back upstairs, Olivia lay beneath the steady glow of surgical lighting, her breathing even, her focus inward, unaware of the exact moment the balance of power outside that room had begun to shift. Ethan remained near the edge, silent now, his earlier certainty replaced with something less defined, a subtle unease he could not yet explain. The staff continued their work, methodical, professional, unaware that the quiet hallway outside, with its blinking camera and empty chairs, had already become the starting point of something much larger than a hospital visit. And in that growing distance between what Ethan believed and what was actually unfolding, the first real crack began to widen, not in the room, not in the machines, but in the structure of a life he had always assumed was unbreakable. The shift did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It moved quietly through systems Ethan had always trusted, through numbers that began to behave differently without explanation, through messages that arrived a few seconds too late, or with information that no longer aligned the way it should have. At first, he did not notice. He stood near the edge of the room, arms folded, watching the staff work around Olivia with clinical precision, telling himself that everything was still contained, still manageable, still within the boundaries of a situation he could control once they left the hospital. But then his phone buzzed again, and this time he looked. The message was short, sent from his chief financial officer, a man who did not send unnecessary alerts. We are seeing unusual activity. Call me. Ethan frowned slightly, his thumb hovering over the screen for a second before stepping out into a hallway, away from the steady rhythm of the monitors, away from the quiet authority of Dr. Brooks. The hallway felt colder than before, emptier, the overhead lights casting sharp reflections across the polished floor. He placed the call immediately. What activity? He asked, his voice low, controlled. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough to signal that the answer would not be simple. We are getting pressure from multiple directions, the CFO replied. Access lines are tightening. There is a hold on a pending transfer we cleared this morning, and someone flagged our short-term liquidity exposure. I did not authorize that review. Ethan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the information. Who did? Another pause. That is the problem, the CFO said. I cannot trace it yet. Ethan turned slightly, glancing back through the glass panel into the room where Olivia lay, surrounded by people who no longer looked at him for direction. For the first time since they arrived, the environment inside that room and the situation unfolding outside of it began to connect in his mind, not clearly, not completely, but enough to create a sense of unease that did not belong to him. Fix it, he said sharply. I do not care how. I want every restriction lifted before the market opens in New York. We are already open, the CFO replied quietly. That landed. Not like a shock, not like a dramatic revelation, but like a slow realization that time had moved forward without his permission. Ethan ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass of the window. Inside the room, Olivia's condition was being monitored with increasing focus, the staff adjusting settings, exchanging brief updates, their attention fully committed to her and the child she carried. Dr. Brooks remained calm, her movements precise, her presence steady, creating a center that did not shift even as the stakes around it quietly rose. Down the hallway, the small red light of the security camera continued its steady blink, recording Ethan's posture, his expression, the exact moment his certainty began to fracture. And several miles away, in an office where decisions were made without hesitation, William Carter reviewed the first batch of files Rebecca had sent, each document building a clearer picture, each detail narrowing the distance between suspicion and action. He did not rush. He did not react emotionally. He simply understood, with absolute clarity, that the man who believed he was managing a situation inside a hospital had already lost control of something far more important, and he had not even realized when it began. The hallway no longer felt like a place of transition, it felt like a boundary, a line between two versions of reality that were beginning to drift apart, one where Ethan still believed he could regain control, and another where control had already slipped beyond his reach without permission or warning. When he stepped back into the room, the atmosphere had changed again, not dramatically, but enough that he noticed the difference immediately. The staff did not look toward him anymore. They did not pause when he entered. Their focus remained fixed on Olivia, on the data moving across the screens, on the quiet but deliberate adjustments that signaled something was being managed with increasing care. Dr. Hannah Brooks stood at the center of that focus, her voice low and steady as she gave instructions, her presence creating a kind of authority that did not rely on volume or force. Ethan moved closer, slower this time, as if aware that stepping too far into that space would no longer produce the same response it had earlier. "What is happening now?" he asked, keeping his tone measured, attempting to reclaim a position he could feel slipping. Dr. Brooks glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply acknowledging his presence before returning her attention to Olivia. "We are stabilizing and monitoring," she said. "That is the only priority." The phrasing was deliberate. Not your priority. Not a shared decision. The only priority. Ethan's jaw tightened again, but he did not push further, not because he agreed, but because something in the room made it clear that pushing would not change the outcome. At the far side of the room, one of the nurses quietly documented readings, her pen moving steadily across a digital tablet, every number, every fluctuation recorded with precision. Another adjusted the angle of a small camera mounted near the doorway, a standard hospital protocol for high-risk situations, ensuring that everything within that space was preserved exactly as it occurred. No one announced it. No one explained it. But the room was now a record as much as it was a treatment area. Outside, the same red light blinked in the hallway, indifferent, consistent, capturing each movement, each expression, each moment that might later be examined frame by frame. Ethan's phone vibrated again, but this time he did not reach for it immediately. He felt it, registered it, and for a brief second chose not to look, as if delaying the information might delay whatever was unfolding beyond his control. But avoidance had never been his strategy, and habit pulled his hand to his pocket anyway. Another message. Shorter this time. "Trading desks are asking questions. We are exposed." The word echoed differently now. Exposed. Not in a report. Not in a negotiation. But in a way that suggested visibility, scrutiny, attention he had not invited. Ethan lifted his gaze, scanning the room again, and for the first time he saw it not as a space he occupied, but as a space he did not own. Olivia lay at the center of it, calm in a way that no longer felt passive, her breathing even, her presence grounded in something deeper than the shifting tension around her. She did not look at him. She did not need to. And that absence of acknowledgement carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Several miles away, William Carter closed the final document on his screen, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed, but the decision already made. He did not need more confirmation. He had enough. He reached for his phone again, issuing another set of instructions, each one precise, each one moving pieces into place that Ethan could not yet see but would soon feel. Back in the hospital, the machines continued their quiet rhythm, the staff continued their work, and in that controlled environment, where everything was designed to maintain stability, a different kind of shift was reaching its point of no return, not marked by noise or announcement, but by the simple, undeniable fact that the story Ethan thought he was managing had already moved beyond him. By the time the next shift of staff rotated through the floor, the hospital no longer felt like a neutral space. It felt like a place where something important had been quietly preserved, documented, and protected without announcement. Rebecca Sloane stepped out of the elevator with a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, her expression composed, her eyes already scanning the hallway as if she were reading a report written in movement instead of words. She did not ask for directions. She had already received everything she needed on her phone: timestamps, room numbers, staff names, access logs. Information did not overwhelm her. It organized itself the moment she saw it. As she walked past the waiting area, she noticed the security camera mounted above the corner, its red indicator light steady, its angle covering both the entrance to the operating room and the stretch of hallway where Ethan had taken his calls. She paused for less than a second, just enough to confirm its position, then continued forward. Inside the room, Olivia remained under observation, her condition stable but closely monitored, her presence calm in a way that no longer felt fragile. Dr. Brooks looked up as Rebecca entered, recognizing immediately that this was not a visitor but someone who understood exactly what kind of moment this had become. "I am Rebecca Sloane," she said, her voice even, professional, offering neither explanation nor apology. "I represent Olivia Carter Hale." The use of the full name was intentional, precise, and it landed in the room with a subtle shift that only a few people noticed but none could ignore. Ethan turned toward her, his expression tightening slightly, not because he recognized her personally, but because he recognized the role she represented. "This is a medical environment," he said, his tone controlled but edged with irritation. "Now is not the time for legal theatrics." Rebecca did not look at him immediately. She stepped closer to Dr. Brooks, lowering her voice just enough to maintain the room's calm while still making her presence known. "Doctor, I will need confirmation that all monitoring, audio logs, and access records from the last 2 hours are secured and preserved under hospital protocol." Dr. Brooks held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "They already are." That answer mattered more than anything else said in the room so far. Rebecca allowed a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement before turning to Ethan. "This is not theatrics," she said quietly. "This is documentation." Ethan let out a short breath, a sound that carried more frustration than confidence now. "You are overstepping," he replied. Rebecca met his eyes directly for the first time. "No," she said. "I am arriving exactly when I am supposed to." The words were simple, but they carried a certainty that did not invite argument. In the hallway, 2 hospital administrators had begun moving toward the room, their expressions neutral but purposeful, alerted not by emotion, but by procedure. The moment something becomes recordable, it becomes reviewable, and once it becomes reviewable, it becomes something larger than a private matter. Inside, Olivia's eyes opened slowly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the doctor, the staff, Rebecca, and finally Ethan. She did not speak. She did not need to. The shift was already complete. Several miles away, William Carter stood as his car pulled to a stop outside the hospital entrance, the city reflected in the dark glass beside him. He did not rush to get out. He adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, controlled, the kind of calm that comes not from uncertainty, but from knowing exactly what the next step will be. And as he stepped onto the pavement, the distance between the world Ethan believed he controlled and the reality that was closing in on him narrowed to something that could no longer be ignored. The elevator doors on the ground floor opened with a soft chime that barely registered against the steady flow of hospital movement, but the man who stepped out did not blend into that rhythm. He moved through it, measured and deliberate, his presence quiet yet unmistakably intentional. William Carter did not look around for direction, he did not hesitate, and he did not announce himself, but the subtle shift in attention from those who recognized him traveled ahead of him like a ripple. By the time he reached the operating floor, the hallway had already begun to change. Conversations lowered. Steps slowed. Not out of fear, but out of recognition that something significant was about to unfold. Inside the room, Rebecca Sloane had positioned herself slightly to the side of Olivia's bed, not obstructing, not intervening, simply present in a way that made absence impossible. Ethan remained near the edge, his posture tighter now, his confidence no longer effortless, replaced by a controlled restraint that required effort to maintain. The door opened quietly, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. William stepped inside, his gaze moving first to Olivia, not scanning, not assessing, simply seeing her. The room held still in a way that was different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but aware. Olivia met his eyes, and something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but recognition, as if a piece of the world she had been holding on her own had just been returned to its rightful place. William did not rush forward. He did not create a scene. He simply moved closer, stopping at a distance that respected the space but redefined it at the same time. "Doctor," he said, his voice calm, even, the kind of tone that did not need volume to carry authority. Dr. Brooks inclined her head slightly. "She is stable," she said. "We are monitoring closely." William nodded once, accepting the information without further question, then turned his attention, slowly, deliberately, toward Ethan. There was no immediate confrontation, no raised voice, no visible anger, but the shift in focus alone changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Ethan straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his stance as if preparing for a negotiation he had not been invited to. "And you are?" he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer certain. William held his gaze for a moment, long enough to make the question unnecessary before answering it. "I am the one who makes sure records are not forgotten," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that extended beyond introduction, beyond identity. Ethan did not respond right away. For the first time since the day began, he did not have an immediate line, a strategy, a calculated response ready to deploy. Behind him, one of the administrators stepped into the doorway, quietly confirming with Rebecca that all documentation had been secured under protocol, that access to certain records was now restricted pending review. The language was procedural, neutral, but its effect was anything but. Ethan's phone buzzed again in his hand, and this time he looked at it immediately. Another message. "We are down 12%. This is accelerating." The number meant something. Not just financially, but structurally. 12% was not a fluctuation. It was a signal. Ethan looked up again, his eyes moving between Rebecca, the administrators, and finally William, and in that moment the connection formed fully, no longer vague, no longer partial. Whatever had started in this room had extended far beyond it. Olivia watched the exchange in silence, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged, but the space around her now anchored by something far stronger than before. And as William remained where he stood, calm, composed, entirely in control of himself and the situation, the reality Ethan had been resisting settled into place with quiet finality, the understanding that this was no longer a situation he could manage, but one he would have to answer for. No one raised their voice, but the room felt smaller, as if the presence of truth had reduced the space available for denial, and Ethan could feel it in the way people no longer looked past him, but through him, measuring, assessing, no longer reacting to who he was, but to what had been recorded. William did not move closer, did not need to, because his presence had already shifted the center of gravity in the room, and everything else adjusted around it. "All records from this floor are now under review," Rebecca said calmly, her voice cutting through the silence with precision rather than force. "No alterations, no deletions, no external access without authorization." The administrator in the doorway confirmed it with a small nod, tablet in hand, already logging the procedural change. Ethan let out a slow breath, one that carried more calculation than emotion, but even that calculation was beginning to fracture under pressure he could not yet fully map. "You are treating this like a criminal matter," he said, his tone controlled, attempting to reframe the narrative into something he could navigate. Rebecca did not react immediately. She allowed the words to settle, then answered with a calm that made the response feel inevitable. "I am treating it like a documented event," she said. "The rest will define itself." That was the problem. Not accusation. Not confrontation. Definition. Because definition could not be negotiated once evidence existed. Ethan's phone vibrated again, and this time the message was not from his chief financial officer. It was from the head of investor relations. "Emergency call requested. Multiple partners pulling back. We need guidance." The word guidance felt almost foreign in his hand. He had always been the one giving it, not receiving requests for it. He glanced at the number again. 12% had become 18%. The line between fluctuation and collapse was narrowing. He lifted his head slowly, looking directly at William now, and for the first time, there was no attempt to mask the question behind strategy. "What is this?" he asked. William's expression did not change. He did not step forward, did not raise his voice, did not need to assert authority because it was already understood by everyone in the room who mattered. "This," he said quietly, "is what happens when a moment that should have remained private becomes undeniable." The phrasing was deliberate. Not punishment. Not revenge. Consequence. And consequence, once set in motion, did not require further explanation. Olivia watched the exchange in silence, her breathing steady, her presence grounded, but something in her gaze had shifted again, not toward either man, but beyond them, as if she could already see the outcome forming before it was spoken. Dr. Brooks continued her work, her focus unwavering, ensuring that within the room, the only priority remained exactly what she had said from the beginning. Outside, the hallway had filled slightly, not with chaos, but with quiet attention, staff moving carefully, aware that something larger than a routine medical situation had taken shape. And somewhere far above, in offices where decisions translated into numbers on screens across the country, the ripple had become a wave, subtle but unstoppable. Ethan looked down at his phone one more time, the numbers shifting again, the messages stacking faster than he could process, and for the first time, the realization settled fully, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth, that whatever leverage he believed he held had already been replaced by something else, something he could not buy, could not silence, and could not undo. Time did not stop, but it began to feel different, heavier, as if each passing minute carried consequences that could no longer be delayed or redirected, and within that shift, the room settled into a new kind of order, one where roles had quietly changed without announcement. Ethan no longer stood as the center of decision-making, he stood as a variable, observed, measured, increasingly irrelevant to the process unfolding around him. Rebecca stepped slightly closer to William, her voice low enough to remain private but clear enough to carry intent. "Preliminary review confirms multiple data points," she said. "Access logs, staff statements, and partial audio capture. Enough to establish sequence." William nodded once, absorbing the information without visible reaction, his focus remaining steady, not on the details themselves, but on what they meant when aligned. "Preserve everything," he said. "Chain of custody cannot break." That phrase alone shifted the situation further, because it moved the event from documentation to admissibility, from record to evidence. Ethan heard it, and this time he did not interrupt. He understood the language, even if he did not yet fully grasp how far it would reach. Instead, he turned slightly away, stepping toward the far side of the room, creating distance that was no longer strategic, but instinctive. His phone remained in his hand, the screen lighting up again and again, messages stacking faster now, each one shorter, more urgent. "We are down 23%. Credit line review initiated. Legal is asking for immediate call." The words blurred together, not because he could not read them, but because for the first time, reading them did not provide control. Across the room, Olivia's condition remained stable, the monitors reflecting consistency, the staff maintaining their careful rhythm, but the emotional landscape had shifted entirely. She was no longer surrounded by uncertainty, but by structure, by people who had drawn a clear line around her and the child she carried, and would not allow that line to be crossed again. Dr. Brooks adjusted a setting, then looked briefly toward William. "She will need rest after this," she said. "Minimal stress. Controlled environment." William inclined his head slightly. "She will have it." The certainty in that statement did not come from reassurance, it came from capability. In the hallway, the administrators had begun coordinating quietly, securing access points, confirming that all relevant data was locked under internal review protocols, their movements efficient, practiced, unaffected by the personal weight of the situation but fully aware of its procedural significance. A hospital was not a courtroom, but it was a place where facts could be preserved in a way that courts depended on. And that transition, from preservation to presentation, had already begun. Ethan finally looked up again, his gaze moving across the room, landing once more on William, then on Rebecca, then on Olivia. There was no anger in his expression now, no immediate strategy forming, only a realization that had arrived too late to be useful. "This is not finished," he said, his voice lower, not a threat, not a declaration, just an acknowledgement that he did not yet know how to respond. Rebecca met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said. "It is just beginning." And in that moment, the boundaries of the situation expanded beyond the hospital walls entirely, beyond the controlled lighting and quiet machines, into a space where timelines would stretch, where records would be examined, where narratives would be challenged and replaced by something far less flexible. Outside, the city continued without pause, traffic moving, people unaware, markets shifting in numbers that did not reveal the human story beneath them. But inside that room, the outcome had already begun to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet certainty that did not require permission to become irreversible. The transition did not happen with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet sequence of decisions that carried the weight of inevitability, each one moving the situation forward into a space where it could no longer be contained within hospital walls. Rebecca stepped slightly away from the center of the room, her phone already in hand, her voice low as she coordinated the next phase with a precision that suggested this was not escalation, but process. "We are moving to formal filing," she said. "All materials will be submitted under expedited review." On the other end, confirmation came quickly. Cases like this did not wait when the structure behind them was strong enough. William remained still, his attention returning briefly to Olivia, not checking, not questioning, simply ensuring that she remained exactly where she needed to be, stable, protected, beyond the reach of anything that had brought them here. Olivia's eyes were open now, her breathing even, her presence steady in a way that no longer reflected uncertainty. She had not spoken, but the silence around her had changed meaning, no longer fragile, but resolved. Across the room, Ethan stood with his phone still in his hand, but he was no longer reading the messages as they arrived. He was watching instead, watching the quiet efficiency with which everything was being redirected, watching the way no one in the room sought his input, his approval, or even his reaction. He had built his life on influence, on the ability to move outcomes with a word, a signature, a decision. And now, for the first time, he was inside a situation where none of those tools applied. "You are making a mistake," he said finally, his voice measured, but lacking the certainty it once carried. It was not a threat. It was an attempt to reclaim ground that no longer existed. Rebecca did not look at him immediately. She finished her message, confirmed the response, and only then turned. "No," she said calmly. "We are correcting one." The distinction mattered. It reframed everything that had happened, not as escalation, but as adjustment, as a movement towards something that should have been in place from the beginning. In the hallway, the administrative team had completed their internal protocols, access restrictions logged, documentation secured, and a quiet note added to the system that would ensure any future inquiry would lead back to this exact point in time, preserved, intact, unaltered. Downstairs, near the entrance, a small group had begun to gather, not because they knew the full story, but because information had started to move in ways that attracted attention. A hospital visit involving a high-profile figure rarely stayed private for long, especially when patterns began to shift in other places at the same time. Inside, Dr. Brooks completed her final check, her focus unwavering, her role unchanged despite everything else that had transformed around her. "She will be moved to a recovery suite shortly," she said. "Limited access." William nodded once. Understood. The words were simple, but they carried authority that extended beyond the room, beyond the hospital, into every system that would now align with that decision. Ethan looked from one person to another, his gaze settling last on Olivia, and for a brief moment, something like recognition passed through his expression, not of guilt, not of regret, but of realization. He had misjudged the scale of what he was dealing with, not in terms of emotion, but in terms of consequence. And that miscalculation had already begun to cost him more than he could immediately measure. As the staff prepared to move Olivia, as Rebecca finalized the first official filings, and as William remained exactly where he stood, calm and unshaken, the path forward became clear, not because it had been announced, but because every piece was now in place. What began in a controlled room under bright surgical lights was no longer confined to that space. It had entered a system where records mattered, where timelines were fixed, and where outcomes were no longer shaped by power alone, but by the undeniable weight of what had already been captured. The next morning did not begin with sunlight or calm, it began with movement, with systems already in motion long before most people opened their eyes, and by the time the first wave of commuters filled the streets of Manhattan, the situation that had started in a quiet operating room had fully entered a different arena. The courthouse stood in sharp contrast to the hospital, not sterile, but heavy, its marble floors carrying the weight of countless decisions that had reshaped lives without spectacle. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, but charged with a different kind of tension, one that did not come from uncertainty, but from anticipation. Rebecca Sloane moved through the hallway with the same controlled precision she had shown the day before, a slim case file in hand, though most of what she needed was already secured digitally, preserved, time-stamped, unaltered. Olivia arrived shortly after, accompanied by a small, discreet medical support team, her movements careful but steady, her presence composed in a way that reflected not weakness, but recovery, not just physical, but something deeper. William walked beside her, not guiding, not shielding, simply there, a constant that did not waver. Ethan arrived separately. He had not slept, though he would not admit it, and the signs were subtle but visible, the slight delay in his reactions, the way his focus drifted for half a second longer than it should have. His phone had not stopped through the night, messages, calls, alerts, each one carrying fragments of a larger collapse that had accelerated while he tried to contain it. When he checked the numbers again, the drop had reached 31%. That was no longer volatility. That was damage. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings began without drama, without raised voices, but with a structure that left little room for deviation. The judge entered, the room stood, then settled, and the process moved forward with the kind of order that did not need to assert authority because it embodied it. Rebecca presented first, not with argument, but with sequence, establishing the timeline, the location, the presence of witnesses, the existence of recorded material. Each point placed carefully, each detail aligned, not exaggerated, not dramatized, simply stated in a way that made it increasingly difficult to deny what had already been preserved. Screens displayed segments of documentation, not invasive, not graphic, but clear enough to confirm context, to anchor the narrative, in fact rather than interpretation. Ethan's legal team responded as expected, raising questions of intent, of stress, of misinterpretation within a medical environment, but the tone lacked conviction, not because the arguments were unfamiliar, but because they were being applied to a situation where the variables had already been narrowed. William did not speak immediately. He did not interrupt. He waited until the structure of the case had been fully established, until the room had settled into the rhythm of evidence and response, and only then did he stand. When he did, the shift was immediate, not loud, not visible, but felt, the kind of presence that recalibrated attention without demanding it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying across the room without effort. "This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record." He paused briefly, allowing the statement to settle before continuing. "And where there is record, there is accountability." The words did not accuse. They defined. And in that definition, the path forward became narrower, clearer, less flexible. Ethan sat still, his gaze fixed ahead, but for the first time since the day before, he was no longer trying to control the outcome, because he understood now that the outcome was no longer something he could influence. It was something he would have to face. The courtroom did not erupt when the decision came, it settled, like a weight finding its place after being suspended for too long, and in that stillness, the outcome carried more impact than any dramatic reaction could have delivered. The judge's words were precise, measured, anchored entirely in what had been presented, documented, preserved, and confirmed, not shaped by emotion, not influenced by status, but guided by the simple, unmovable structure of record and accountability. The findings were clear, the implications immediate, and while the legal process would continue beyond this moment, the direction had been set in a way that could not be reversed. Ethan remained seated as the room shifted around him, his legal team already leaning in, speaking quietly, outlining next steps, appeals, damage control, strategies that sounded familiar but no longer carried the certainty they once had. His phone vibrated again, but this time he did not look at it, because he already knew what it would say. Numbers had continued to fall. Partners had continued to withdraw. Confidence, once assumed, had evaporated under scrutiny he could not deflect. Across the room, Olivia sat with a calm that did not seek attention, her posture steady, her presence no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she had endured and moved through. She did not look at Ethan. She did not need closure from him, because closure had already taken shape in a different form, one that did not depend on apology or acknowledgement. William stood beside her, not as a shield, not as a force imposing itself, but as a constant, a presence that had ensured the truth did not disappear into silence. He did not celebrate. He did not react outwardly at all. For him, this was not victory. It was alignment. Outside the courthouse, the city continued without pause, taxis moving, people crossing streets, screens updating with financial data that told part of the story but not all of it. Inside, the final exchanges concluded, papers were gathered, voices lowered, and the structure of the room returned to its neutral state, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even though everything had changed. As Olivia stood to leave, she paused for a brief moment, her